Still trickling in. Well, why don't we get started? So, good morning to those in the US and good afternoon to those in Europe. I'm Jarman Ye, faculty at the Institute for Health and Aging at the University of California, San Francisco, and co-director of the Emancipatory Sciences Lab. I'm so pleased that the Emancipatory Sciences Lab is able to co-host this event with Routledge. Before we begin our programming, I just want to do a brief introduction. Please introduce yourself by typing your name and where you're from into the chat so that we can all meet you. And to tell you a little bit about the Emancipatory Sciences Lab, it was founded in 2021 by Dr. Carol Estes in response to the alienation and despair we were all experiencing from the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing racial and social injustices in our society. The leadership team of the Emancipatory Sciences Lab currently includes 4 incredible graduate students in the Sociology PhD program here at UCSF: Courtney Nam, Brittany Pond, Melissa Victor, and Rebecca Wolf. I'm also joined by Nicholas DiCarlo and Jennifer James as co-director of the lab. The lab is a network of scholars at UCSF and beyond who are committed to anti-oppressive praxis inside and outside the academy. We welcome you to visit our website to learn about folks in our network and the resources and activities we've been developing, which include the Routledge Aging and Society book series, a clearinghouse of papers by folks in our network, a blog, and a podcast called EDGES, which is an acronym that stands for Engaging Dialogues Generating Emancipatory Sciences. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, so follow us there. Please let us know if you'd be interested in getting more involved with the lab. We welcome your creative ideas about collaboration for this unfolding vision. You can email us at emancipatorscienceslab@ucsf.edu or scan this QR code to provide your ideas. So without further ado, I will turn the mic over to my colleague, Nicholas.
Thanks, Jarman. So just to briefly introduce what we're doing today, each of these scholars has committed themselves to decades of social research that contest austerity policies and the neoliberal myths that enforce normative experiences of aging, challenging assumptions about biomedicalization, precarity, and expanding our vision of what aging can mean. I'm going to invite the authors to correct or expand on any of the information I introduced them with because they've done so much, I cannot possibly capture a tenth of it. The first person I'm going to introduce, Dale Dannefer, has covered so much terrain. Dale's work integrates biosocial and hermeneutic frameworks to examine inequalities across the life course. His work demonstrates the interconnectedness of disciplinary approaches and the power of expanding our gerontological imagination, especially when it comes to long-term care. So Dale, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin with.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, and this is exciting for me to be here and hear about my colleagues' books and talk a little about mine. So just to get started on that, in the study of aging and related fields, we've seen a steady stream of new kinds of evidence indicating the large extent to which age and human development are shaped by experience and by one's place in social structure, whether in the form of the socioeconomic gradient, findings about the impact of epigenetic processes, for example, on the impact of loneliness on physiological functioning, or the connection between education and reduced dementia risk. And yet, perhaps especially in the United States, virtually every such new discovery tends to be met with a rush of efforts to redefine and reduce the evidence of social causation from its social origins to an individual level problem. somehow seen as reflecting, if not a gene, then lifestyle choices or agency or supposed personality characteristics such as resilience. This reductionist inclination to contain socially expansive evidence and keep the discourse on traditional individual level terms has been greatly reinforced by what I've called a functional organismic nexus, a symbiotic and intellectually unhealthy codependence of functionalist theory in sociology and a largely traditional organismic paradigm in psychology, frameworks that both fall well within the comfort zone of established paradigms in the study of age and development in the social and behavioral sciences. So my book, Age and the Reach of Sociological Imagination, tries to expose the damage caused by the functional organismic nexus in both theory and practice, in restricting inquiry, and specifically in squelching sociological imagination. It offers examples of what a sociological approach to aging might be like if, as a field, we began to mobilize the potentials of sociological imagination. This involves much more than an academic issue of abstract theoretical nitpicking. It has everything to do with how we understand human social and institutional arrangements, which are generally invisible or assumed to be benign under paradigmatic assumptions of the nexus, the functional organismic nexus, but in fact are often humanly destructive. Thus, the actual degree of their beneficence in their human destructiveness require interrogation. Is it the task of science to try to help people adjust to life in nursing homes and placate them, or given the documented destructiveness of human potentials of the institutional forms of traditional nursing homes, should we point out the need to eliminate such institutions altogether and replace them and nurture alternative forms of human care? Do we accept as legitimate and unavoidable the harm done by so-called correctional facilities that warehouse young people, or the school to prison pipeline, which has almost become an institutionalized life course transition for some subcultures of young people? Should we do evaluation programs for youth caught in such institutions, or should we take issue with the racism and related cultural forces responsible for such arrangements in the first place? Age and the Reach of Sociological Imagination contends that these are the kinds of questions we are compelled to confront when we take seriously an expanded understanding of the power of social forces over human lives. So just quickly about the book. The first part of the book is interdisciplinary, making explicit the great degree to which human development and age are socially constituted phenomena. And I then turn to an examination of how the dynamics of social systems act back on and reshape development, aging, and life course opportunities. The final chapters consider the emancipatory potentials of such knowledge and attention to sociological imagination. If gerontology and life course studies claim to be fields that care about the potentials and interests of older people and of individuals through the life course, the first thing that is required is to scrutinize the taken for granted assumptions of social science that too often conform to dominant cultural narratives. There is clearly no longer any scientific basis for taking for granted quote unquote normative patterns as depicting of the life course or aging as depicting human nature or as particularly desirable even. And there's no warrant simply to declare that we all have agency. What is required is to clarify the extent to which agency is shaped and constricted, usually unwittingly, by social forces. freedom isn't free, emancipation isn't free. And the book seeks to illustrate and encourage the use of sociological analysis and imagination to further the interests and potentials of the human life course. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dale. I'm really eager for all of you to be in dialogue with each other and to also talk about how your work has informed each other's work. So please keep in mind as you're listening to each other to jot down questions, because we want to welcome questions from our audience, but also to hear how you put each other's work in dialogue. All right. So our next participant is Chris Phillipson. Teen Buffle and Chris Phillipson's book insists on spatializing justice for older people, expanding older subjects from bodies to be medically managed or a statistical cohort to budget for, to people whose desire to remain connected and embedded in their communities and homes becomes legible. This incredible book is available by open access, so you can all download it today.
That's true. Yes, thanks very much, Nicholas. And I'm sorry my colleague Tina Buffle couldn't join us, but I'm very much speaking on her behalf and with her. And we very much like to thank the editors of the series and Dean for supporting the book, which we're very grateful for, and also the colleagues at Manchester Urban Aging Research Group. Well, the book, I think, works within what we would call a critical gerontological political economy framework, and tries to apply this to the urban environment, which we see, Tina and I see, as a source of new forms of inequality and injustice. And the book really rests on a series of arguments, and the key ones of which are trying to understand what we call the local expression of macro social forces as they're played out in different communities. Then understanding the ways in which older people can be agents of social change in transforming urban environments. And also developing the basis of what we would call a rights-based approach to the city, applied to the lives of minoritized communities, those living in low-income neighborhoods, and so on. Then a theme which is pursued through the book is that on the one hand, we talk a lot about supporting aging in place, and that's a pillar, if you like, of public policy. But on the other hand, we argue that the places in which people are aging have become undermined through forces associated with gentrification, deindustrialization, austerity, and climate change. And those issues are explored in different ways in the book. So through this analysis, the book develops what we would call a political economy of the city, one which draws on David Harvey and others, but applying that to population aging. And the argument is that population aging has run parallel with the decline in vital facilities or social infrastructure, what some people call the urban commons. That urban environments are themselves becoming progressively unequal, where the forces of property increasingly present cities with two options: gentrification on the one side, disinvestment on the other. And that crucially in this analysis, cities are viewed as drivers of inequality. You know, they're not just crucibles of other social and economic forces, although that is the case, but cities themselves develop forces which reproduce and develop inequality in different ways. and also privilege certain groups, wealthy elites and professionals, as contrasted with the needs of those aging in place, women living alone, those living on the streets, and minority groups. So having set out that analysis, we then explore how the structural pressures can be challenged through different forms of collective organization on the part of older people. And we give various examples which have emerged, none of which are perfect: village model, naturally occurring retirement communities, co-housing. But we explore those in terms of how far they can contribute to an emancipatory urban gerontology, which could be developed. So finally, I think, Nicholas, the argument is that such work will involve a reimagining of aging in place as a broad social and community endeavor, rather than an individual route into later life. And the issue becomes, how can we use the resources of the city to benefit older people? How can aging be a normal part of what happens to a city? And the book concludes with an agenda for change, which develops a rights-based approach to aging, tries to link the age-friendly theme, which is again important for the book, to other debates around sanctuary cities, solidarity cities, rebel cities. An important argument about how do we develop mobility justice as a key part of spatial justice, mobility justice which supports people with a disability who are at the moment disenfranchised within urban environments. And finally, a big part of the book, partly reflecting Tina's own pioneering work on this, is issues about co-production and co-research. Just to pick up on your last point to finish, Nicholas, I think the book does, come out of work which Dale and Jan talk about in their books, in the sense that I think it's developing the social context of aging. In our book, the social context of aging is obviously the city, but there's also an issue about spatial justice. So we think that spatial justice is an important dimension of the issue of social justice, which Jan obviously writes very eloquently about in his book. So great honor to be part of the series and to be inspired by Carol and many others who have contributed to it. And I know that Tina was sorry not to be here.
Thank you, Chris. You have me reflecting on 9 years ago when Carol introduced me to you all for the first time at GSA in Orlando. We were all in Disneyland, which is probably the most bizarre place to think about aging. So yeah, just sharing that with participants that this work comes together in kind of strange but provocative ways that make us really think about who we're with and where we are in space and time. All right, I'll shift now to you, Jan. Jan's known for his philosophical curiosity, exploring how realities and epistemes of aging are constructed through time and access. His book, Long Lives Are for the Rich, confronts the capitalist promise, and exposes it as a violent lie. Right, Jan.
Thank you, Nicholas. That's beautiful. I'm very grateful and very pleased to join the discussion, and also very pleased to see my cherished old comrades again, and hope we can continue our cooperation more closely. My book is motivated by a deep concern about the direction the so-called developed countries are taking, and I've tried to articulate some of the main dynamics that are at play here. These dynamics will inevitably affect aging people. Aging is not a stable natural process that repeats itself in every individual. Older people's health, income, healthcare, social contacts, housing, transportation, or communication are affected by social inequalities. often even stronger than they hit other age groups, as inequalities tend to become deeper as cohorts get older. In my book, I'm speaking about a neoliberal turn of capitalism to emphasize the continuity, but also the difference with earlier forms of capitalism. A main characteristic of the neoliberal turn is still the accumulation and concentration of enormous wealth. Marx wrote extensively about that. But also now, in the form of the changing is in the form of monopolies and oligopolies that are invading the private lives of individuals by relating to them as friends, but sucking useful information out of them to manipulate their behavior. So this is really a new phenomenon. This is covered up by the ideology of an inflated individual autonomy, according to which you can become whatever you want and that your life is decided by your choices and decisions. This is a toxic cocktail because at a certain moment, people will realize that they did work hard, made the right choices at the time, but still ended up in bad situations because they got unemployed, their savings evaporated in the banking crisis, or they became chronically ill. This realization can easily explode in anger and mistrust against the political system because they have been misled and abandoned by without adequate support. In my book, I analyzed the destructive impact of neoliberal policies and propose ways to think about more adequate concepts of autonomy, citizenship, capabilities, and human rights as social rights. The neoliberal turn of capitalism has developed most strongly in the US, where we can also see its problematic effects most clearly. The prime suspect of my investigation is, however, not the US, but the neoliberal model. In a way, the population of the US has been hijacked by neoliberal policies and has become its prime victim. I am very aware that the US is much more complex than this model and that a major minority of its population disagrees with these policies. But the American version of neoliberalism is still a dominant developmental model which continues to influence other nations because it attracts economic and political elites with its accumulation and concentration of wealth. The leading slogans of the neoliberal turn are, first, that free markets are the backbone of a free society. The second slogan is that individuals are responsible for their societal fate. Consequently, a major negative effect of the international proliferation of the neoliberal model has been the gradual demolition of a supportive life course that had also been institutionalized in the US over the first 3 decades after the Second World War, be it in a modest and racially biased form. The combination of idealized innocent markets and individual responsibility has led to the rise of an entrepreneurial life course. The individual citizen is seen as somebody whose social activities are basically investments, who takes part in society at his or her own risk, and will be held individual responsible for success or failure. Forms of care and support in a broad sense can be bought on the market by those who can afford them. The accumulated wealth is not productively invested in the well-being of the population. Private wealth is therefore accompanied by public poverty. This model has led to a serious decline of upward social mobility and a structural premium on privileged birth. In fact, a new aristocracy that is presented as a meritocracy. What are the implications for aging studies? Well, we can define gerontology as the study of people who are, for instance, 65 years and older, but citizens with a low socioeconomic standard typically live 10 years shorter and are confronted with 20 years earlier onset of chronic disease than those with the highest SES. They may not even reach old age, or rather, their middle age is already old age. In my opinion, these findings change the subject matter of aging studies dramatically. In studying aging cohorts, we need to pay attention to selective mortality, including those who are already dead, even before or shortly after reaching old age. A part of such deaths will be unavoidable, but many of them will die or become chronically ill from avoidable causes. And this is where questions of social justice and the organization of the life course begin. So indeed, long lives are for the rich. The answer to increasing health inequalities has mainly been more healthcare and the call for better health behavior with the support of big pharma. These policies have led to an extremely high healthcare expenditure per capita, often more than double the amount spent per capita in other OECD countries, with mediocre results on clinical outcomes and a disastrous score on preventable mortality. In 2019, before the COVID pandemic began to distort basic trends, US life expectancies were 5.18 years behind the highest scoring Swiss men and 5.82 years behind Japanese women. To put these maybe seemingly small differences in perspective, according to the CDC, the elimination of all cancer deaths would increase life expectancy by only 3 years. These dramatic health inequalities are only the first layer of and caused by much broader social inequalities of material resources and relational respect. So, social inequalities are not only of income and wealth, but also of race, gender in an inclusive sense, age, and segregation. The interaction of these different social inequalities over time is heavily influenced by mechanisms such as cumulative advantage and disadvantage. Although there is not complete determination, family resources appear crucial in sorting citizens from birth into those who will receive minimal care and resources, who will go to underfunded schools versus those who will enjoy all available opportunities to develop and will be cheered on as they progress through the life course. I began to explore the subject of social justice and aging by reading theories of social justice from Callahan, Daniels, and McCurley, so the dominant theories. They show, however, a rather rudimentary understanding of aging, building on age groups, and age stages, or the young versus the old, without any consideration of the core of social inequalities within age groups, within birth cohorts, or among the young and the old. Moreover, what should, according to these theories, be distributed equally between so-called generations are monetary resources, resulting mostly in criticizing healthcare for older people as a bottomless pit. Besides critical analysis, we need an emancipatory perspective that can address social inequalities over the life course. To close up, I mentioned just very briefly, first, an empowerment approach to autonomy and freedom, aiming at participating in government and institutions, besides autonomy as the right to be protected from outside influences, which is the common understanding. A relational approach to social justice, besides distributive justice. A social approach to human rights as entitlements to sufficiency of basic needs. An emphasis on social goods instead of dominant monetary approaches. Quality of education, working conditions, living conditions for all the people inside and outside institutions, subsidized supermarkets in food deserts instead of information campaigns about health, behavior, and obesity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I'm really glad we're getting into specific directions that we can go, that we're not just talking about health disparities in a way that threatens to kind of normalize them or just kind of take the temperature, but to talk about real material differences that would matter to people today. Next, I'm going to introduce Dean Berkenkamp, who's our editor extraordinaire at Routledge. He owned and operated Paradigm Press, and he's just the most humble, good guy I know. I'm going to turn it over to him.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. And I want to start by saying we've been working together on the series and with Carol since 2016. And I feel really lucky to be working with such distinguished scholars in this book series and learning from them, but also learning from the early career authors and books we have in this series as well, because they're all so important. And so I have a very different and more informal chat that's reflections on publishing and writing, and it's more directed to the early career people who may be contemplating their first book, and which can seem at first a formidable task. And I can't speak as a scholar today, but I've been 45 years a book editor, and I have been about 3 years in writing a recent book. So I'll speak from those experiences. So I think that there are ways to turn the prospect of writing a book into a real adventure that's very exciting and stimulating, and cuts through some of the natural lethargy we all may have, because you may have been doing a lot of research for a long time and only barely put pen to paper. And I want to make a few suggestions. One is, it's never too early to get in touch with a book editor at publishing houses and to preview your book idea with them. The reality of editors is that we are overwhelmed every single day with impossible volumes of email. Well, I guess who isn't? But it's really not always the best way to do it. And a better way is to go to a major national conference, and about 2 months ahead, before editors start booking their own meetings, reach out with a little précis, maybe 2 paragraphs, that is the big story of your book. What are the big findings, implications as you plan it? And many times the editor will take those appointments, and you'll start a dialogue that will help shape your book, beyond its form as a thesis or a dissertation, toward what is attractive to publishers. And in such presentations, you want to emphasize how your book could be teachable in classes, whether they're upper division classes usually, or even mid or lower level classes. But that beginning a dialogue with an editor early is never a bad thing to do. And it helps you shape what the big story of your book is going to be, which you always must keep your vision pointed toward. A second piece of advice is, choose a couple of model books in your field that you think you would like to aspire to, that you think are good models for you. And you might choose these for different reasons. You might choose a model because you like the writing craft of the book, for example, the style. Or you might like how they marshal the evidence. Let's say it's ethnographic evidence and how it unfolds the book. Or it might be a model of the goals of the book, like maybe policy-oriented and driving toward those policy conclusions. But I think it's always valuable to have at least 1 or 2 model books before you start writing. The next point is, the next job really is to find your voice. And it may not be the same as the model book or the model books you've chosen, but this is the part of the project that can get you off the mark. And I actually, now having just completed a book last fall, and reflecting on my own experience of working on that, I'm going to make a controversial suggestion, which is start writing before you've finished your research. Now, you should have a lot of it done, if not most of it. But I think it's really important as a driving, motivating force to begin writing itself, and to take your time thinking about, how do you want this book to open? How do you want to capture the reader's attention? How can you fit your craft? How can you establish your craft and your voice? And to start doing that early, because it can get you past the stuck point of, oh my God, I've got to start writing this book. and it's a big task. I won't say otherwise, but it's a way where you can begin to shape in a way that's exciting to yourself and you think will capture the interest of other readers. And that might, and I think, and carry that through the project so that maybe you're starting each chapter with rhetorical questions to get at the reader's interest. Maybe you're starting it with an ethnographic scene. And I would suggest very briefly at first an outtake from the scene you might further unfold in that chapter, but then you want to use the outtake to go to key questions that are in the chapter. So I think that writing itself, having your voice, starting the process, being selective and choosy, and even sometimes waiting for the right day where you feel the inspiration about how you want to start out the book, how you want to start out chapters, is really important as a driving force in carrying you through this big project. I think it's that voice that helps propel you through a big project like this. So I will just finish off with those observations and welcome any questions.
So much, Dean. I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce Carol Estes, whose book, The Aging Enterprise, I think has served as a model, like you've mentioned, Dean, for so many in the field. Carol, would you like to say a few words and also make the case? Why write?
Make the case why write.
Mm-hmm.
Every day I'm writing notes, and they may be a few sentences. And most recently, I've been taken, of course, by the current political battles going on in US politics and the effort of Joe Biden to advance the concept of Build Back Better. And it's a signal idea that would embrace engagement, empowerment, and all sorts of paradigm shifts in small and large way. And I've been very much provoked by his concept, or the concept of the power of the pen, which the president and everyone has a power of the pen, their own pen and others' pens. And I think continuing the voice of your own muse, as it were, and writing a little bit every day, which is not the book, but is an opportunity to see your own and hear your own voice and connect with other voices. Because I first wrote a book when my mom was writer of murder mysteries, and she for Doubleday Crime Club. And I told her, Mom, I can't speak. And I'd been in a very patriarchal setting growing up in Texas. And she said, honey, you can always write books. And that stuck in my mind, that I could, even if I couldn't speak verbally, I could speak by making notes and taking books without jumping into a big book thing that would be very intimidating. But I find taking notes and the power of the pen, and I'm following Biden's power of the pen and in the various statements that and projects that he's developing most recently, which is a big one on women. And he engages 50 agencies and gives them a question. And what are they going to do with these agencies to move this issue of women along? And I just urge all of us to be committed to the power of our own pen and not be so intimidated that it's an erasure of our own agency, to borrow phrases. And of course, the structural and the agency pieces of our own voice are vital to moving ourselves forward too, to be engaged and advancing this field. And Dean Berkenkamp is absolutely the best editor, more than editor. He is just brilliant in moving us along. And I want to acknowledge what he has done has enabled me and Nicholas DiCarlo, and Jarman Ye, to advance our own voices. And I hope we're going to continue, all of us, building back better our own resume and work by jumping in the power of the pen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I think there's a theme in a lot of our works about writing back and writing as an act of resistance and defining more clearly what we're resisting. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions from the panelists for the panelists.
Well, to start, and to open the discussion maybe on one specific point that interests me, which is what is the moral status of emancipatory science? If you look at the origin of the term emancipatory science, we get at the early work of Habermas, who would distinguish three basic interests for our knowledge. So the technical interest, the practical interest, and the emancipatory interest. And he said that the social scientists should follow the emancipatory interest. But his model, so at that time, was psychoanalysis, in the sense that, and that he translated into a theory of society, and it turned emancipatory science into the self-knowledge of society, so to speak. So, like a subject should be aware of his being himself, society should be aware of or transparent about its own being. But there's no argument for what would be better. So what would be moral advancement besides them being aware of your maybe very shitty society that you're in? So what is better? And then he turned into his discourse theory, and he tried to develop arguments, but they were, so to speak, rules of discourse aimed at finding truth for all times and all places. And that's where I disconnected from his theory of society. And maybe that's my Adorno background, that I think it's important to write about your society from the perspective that you are a participant, and that your responses to equality and inequality and injustice are impulses that you should take serious, and that you're not going to not immediately going to deconstruct them as my highly individual responses, and other people have other responses, etc. But really to take them serious as something which has to do with the quality of society from the perspective of a participant. And so I have taken that seriously in my book, I think, and not holding back my criticism. And I wonder what others would have to say about this. How do you jump to a moral stance that is more than your highly personal perspective? I mean, how can you justify that? Well, that's could say more about it, but I think it's clear what I think I'm indicating.
Well, may I wonder, Jan, what you think Habermas's response would be, or maybe I know you've interacted with him, maybe you know, what would his response be to what you're saying? I think in some perhaps inadequate interpretations of Habermas, this his emphasis on discourse and communication for getting to a more positive place. Some would say it would encompass and agree with what you just articulated. So what do you think Habermas would say about what you just said, I guess would be my question.
Yes, I understand. I think he would say that his discourse model has been very effective and fruitful for scientific enterprises, scientific endeavors, but not for moral questions like what is the good life. And he explicitly articulated in his discourse theory that discourses cannot give a conclusive opinion, a conclusive verdict on that, what he called Wahrhaftigkeit or authenticity. That is, discourse is not able to come to a conclusion about moral right, or now let's say not come to a conclusion about what would be the good life. And I think also that he broke off his discourse theory there, and he saw it as a kind of fruitful endeavor, but it did not really answer the question what would be the good life that we want to achieve if we speak about emancipatory sciences.
Resonates with the question that I've been contemplating about how and why settler colonialism has been so absent from critical aging scholarship. It seems to be changing now, but it's been so much more of a mainstay in Marxist sociology and neo-Marxist thought, and it feels like kind of maybe one of our failures of the gerontological imagination in our field, in our cohort, to kind of do more like digging deep about what is a good life and whose lives are being counted in that equation.
I suppose my only thought on this, I don't think I can get into the good life debate, but I mean, I think what comes out from Jan's book is the extent to which societies, and not just true of US society, certainly, is imposing systematic harms on people. We had an important study in the UK that came out last week, showed the extraordinary rise of what's called deaths of despair, i.e. deaths through alcohol, suicide, and drugs, and the clear class relationship, and actually also linked to ethnicity, living in urban areas, and so on. So you have a society that is brutalizing many groups, and so the question then becomes for me, in terms of emancipation, what are the, in terms of emancipatory social science and emancipatory gerontology, what are the alternatives that as social scientists we can explore? I mean, Tina and myself developed this to a certain extent in our book, and to some extent that was one of the attractions, I think, for thinking about urban environments, because they do offer political, social, and cultural forces which potentially can be mobilized. So kind of you're moving away from the abstract to something which is more concrete in terms of thinking about the challenges and responding to them that we can face.
Yeah. But what did you mean by the rights approach in your book? This must have something to do with it.
Well, there's a question. There's a question in the chat. I don't know, Nicholas, do you want to read that out? There's a question from one of the participants in the chat room.
UD's written that all the scholars have referred to the need for advancing a human rights-based approach. Why in particular do you think this is important? What can be the added value of a human rights-based perspective to approach aging societies? And what could change in aging societies with a human rights-based perspective?
Well, I think from my point of view, I think, I mean, Peter Townsend started off this debate actually in some years ago, arguing for the value of using the United Nations framework of human rights applied to later life. I mean, you could argue that that's become more relevant given the kind of changes that we've been talking about, the extent to which collective support for older people has been undermined, the lack of the absence of institutional support in key areas. So, you know, that does, if you don't have a welfare state that's providing a framework of rights, then you have to think of other alternatives. Where they come from and how you guarantee those rights, given the context of neoliberalism, which we talked about, then I think it becomes much more difficult. I think this was one of the problems with Townsend's model. And you could argue that although we have a framework of human rights established in just after the Second World War, it's trampled on universal, you know, in numerous countries, people's rights are simply not acknowledged or trampled upon. So how you institutionalize these rights in the context, in the present day context, I think is very difficult. But I don't know what, you know, my colleagues think about that.
Yeah, are there ways that we can combat exploitation and extraction? Are there respiratory practices that we can envision? Not just like enshrining rights in institutions, but like also like designing institutions with the aim of restoring what's been taken or stolen.
There's a question from Kevin and El Cerrito in the chat that maybe is a way to think about answering this. Kevin writes, interesting to hear Jan's talk. Could the aging population become the moral voice, force for universal basic human rights?
Well, some thoughts about this question of rights and emancipatory science. I think, so continuing my thinking about that, rights should be seen in the context of experienced suffering. So the emphasis comes on social inequality instead of constructions of equality. I think the problem with human rights is that they tend to move the discourse in two directions, that they make constructions of equality for all times and all places, because they are human rights, and that they individualize the human rights. And if you move away from equality towards inequality, from a participatory standpoint, so that you experience, that you see inequalities around you, you get not into this, not so easily, into this trap of constructing equality. And also, you do not so easily get into the trap of individualizing human rights. which has been the main discourse. So then human rights are interpreted as social rights in connection to actually experienced inequalities. And there's finally, I think, still a very valid view of Marshall about human rights and citizenship, which is that the first layer is equality before the law, so civic rights, and this presupposes political participation rights, because you want to have a say about the law that you are equal for. But this political participation rights presuppose again social rights. And I think this is really important problem in contemporary society, because we have political participation rights, but there are no social rights that support and make possible the political participation rights, and also to make very unequal the political participation rights, and also the civic rights where everybody is supposed to be equal for the law. So the emphasis comes on diagnosing and combating social inequality, and interpreting human rights as social rights as a basis for political participation and equality before the law. That's very short. I hope that makes sense.
I think the issue of rights is extremely important and obviously fundamental. It is a focus on rights alone. Is not the only thing we have to focus on. Just my reaction to the discussion. First, I want to agree with what Nicholas sort of asked about a couple minutes ago. I think we do have a would you call it northern bias or something? And I don't have any. I just want to acknowledge that. I think that is an issue that I've started to think more about myself. But what I wanted to say in relation to rights, I'm thinking about kids in correctional facilities where their legal rights. They are there. There's been no violation of rights in terms of what's officially formal legal status, etc. But it's a very destructive place because of the particular form of the organization, and there are better ways to do it. This is actually something I draw on the work of Anna Stetsenko and her colleagues, who is a Vygotskian psychologist, who's doing actual practical interventions in places like detention centers and the correctional facilities for teenagers, who are, if you actually, what is missing in the protection of rights there is that there's no voice, no autonomy, no life, basically, in the day-to-day routines of the facility. So it turns out to be a conflict-ridden, destructive situation for the residents, the inmates, one might say, and for the staff, and using ideas of basically, I would say, emancipatory science, or a sense of liberative possibilities, by empowerment, really, by giving a chance for the inmates to have a voice and to have a little bit more evidence that they're cared about as people and allowed to do things as people. They've actually changed the culture of such places, and in a way that's even impacted some of the policies. And so I think, so the terms that come to mind as I listen to this is there's also a need, in addition to rights, for ways to change institutions to be more empowering of the people who have to live within them. As long as I'm talking, I also want to say thanks to Carol. I didn't see you at the beginning. I don't think you were we're on, but I just want to thank Carol and Dean who for all your both of your great encouragement and critique and advice and inviting me to be part of this in the first place. So.
Yeah, just to add on, Dale, I think you're right. I mean, I don't think I think just a fairly modest approach, if you like, to rights in terms of thinking of using it as a framework for thinking about principles which need and possibilities and potentials which could be adopted in residential care settings and other settings. I think that is important. I mean, we saw how in the COVID-19 pandemic, how disastrous that was in institutional settings. And there, I think that wasn't just about rights, well, it wasn't just about resources, but it was an appalling abuse of human rights and discrimination. In many countries, we saw this. So, I think situations like the pandemic has exposed issues about the abuse of rights, discrimination, and thinking about, well, what are the principles we want to think about in running running institutions, and many of which, of course, are now deregulated, privatized, where the debate about, which has, I think, put a spotlight on rights-based issues. If you're operating in an environment where deregulation is the norm, then it seems to me we have to start taking these discussions more seriously, or else, as we see in crisis situations, people are absolutely abused.
Seeing one more question from Yudi about spatial justice. Chris, could you unpack a little bit more about that concept? What does it mean for aging and why are they relevant? How can they be materialized? Are there
Sorry, can you repeat that, Nicholas? Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, one more question from Yudi. The scholars have emphasized the importance of social and spatial justice in aging societies. Can you unpack a little bit more about those concepts? Social and spatial justice. What do they mean for aging, and how can they be realized?
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of examples where we see people not being able to have access to resources and facilities within urban areas. And of course, one of the reasons for this is that within urban areas, much of these land and facilities have been privatized, particularly over the last 2 decades. So in terms of trying to build environments which people can enjoy, have access to, and have rights to, you're up against corporate organizations who control and influence the nature of those facilities. So there is a real tension between what is now a global movement to build what we call age-friendly environments which people feel empowered by, which encourage their participation. And on the other side, the privatization of environments where access is strictly controlled and your rights are strictly controlled. And this, of course, has been, and arguments have been developed over a number of years by scholars like David Harvey, Edward Soja. And I think what we try and do in the book is apply that critical urban geography to a way of thinking about opening up cities so that people can have access to them in a more equal way. So issues about equity alongside spatial justice, I think, is a really important set of questions to consider.
I know in the U.S. and especially New York right now, food justice is a big part of that conversation, and urban farming, and yeah, the food deserts that exist in these urban centers is a huge issue.
Well, if you take the UK, Nicholas, local authorities, municipal authorities have had to sell off 60% of their land over the last 10 years because of financial pressures. So land which was once public, we owned it. The public owned that land. The public could influence what happened on that land. That's now in private hands. Often foreign companies now own that land, foreign capitalist organizations. You know, there are large parts of our city, the capital city, London, which are controlled by foreign corporations who buy up whole streets and just use them as investment vehicles. So, you know, this is the kind of political economy of the city that I think is, you know, we urgently need to put a spotlight on in terms of our debates about aging.
Well, I'm noticing that we only have about 7 more minutes, so I want to see if there are any more questions that are coming up for people. Drop them in the Q&A or the chat, or any questions that we have from our panelists about what we've covered or haven't covered today. I'm always inclined to talk more about authoritarianism and fascism, that neoliberalism is like often a little too tidy, or like doesn't talk about kind of the ideologies of like how some of this violence is intentional. So I can prod us there if no one has another direction for us to go.
About fascism?
Yeah, that
Well,
you know, corporations' power and their relationship with fascism
yeah,
extends like way beyond just the neoliberal model of the
yes,
free market. It's the freedom to oppress market.
yeah. Well, I guess fascist policies are bred and fed into by this problems people get in because of neoliberalism. So there's a connection there. And my first book that I wrote was about fascism in the work of Adorno, who wrote a lot about Auschwitz and also about fascist propaganda. And one of the shocking experiences of the last years is that I hear Trump saying literally versions of German expressions like Lügenpresse, etc. So about journalists, about people who don't agree, about other people. They're literally translations of the fascist propaganda. And this is, of course, well, things that worry us all. And but there's a link with neoliberalism, that the disaster of neoliberalism gives I think, opportunity to people who manipulate the misery and project it to others. They're not people who they are not people who have the fate of the people they manipulate at heart. So there's no better future for them. It's always the others that are inflicting harm, and it's always about more expansion and more Lebensraum and more life space for the leader, so to speak. I think that's a pattern that we can unfortunately see often.
The discussion makes me want to recommend a book. I'm not sure it's a Routledge book, so I'm not sure that's allowed.
Go for it.
It's a book called, maybe you've seen it, Private Government by Elizabeth Anderson, who's a law professor at Michigan. And she just lays out in the book how people think of government as the public political institutions, but she details how much of really many of our lives, and certainly the lives of anyone who works for many corporations, there's all kinds of government going on, control over people's lives, rules that govern people's lives in the workplace, in schools, private schools different than public, et cetera, that are really forms of control that governments exercise that are being exercised privately. So just thinking about your point, Chris, about how much of the public space, which may also be true of other things besides physical space, like how much of one's day one controls, that's under the, anyway, Private Government, Elizabeth Anderson. I don't know the publisher.
Elizabeth
Great.
Anderson
Link in the chat.
Elizabeth Anderson theory plays an important role in my book.
Right.
Cite her a lot because I think she's really a wonderful and important thinker about relational justice as distinguished from distributive justice. One of the main voices there.
One of the things that I think is rather kind of challenging from this discussion, and I'm just trying to think how we can move it to conclude it on a different note. I mean, it seems to me the argument from Jan and Dale is about having an under-institutionalized society, a society where supportive structures have retreated, where we have a very strong state. It's not that the state has withered away, but the state acts in the interest of corporations. It doesn't act in the interests of supporting vulnerable individuals, if you like. So, I mean, in our book, Tina and myself try and address this through asking, well, what are the things that individuals can do within their environment to support themselves in times of crisis, but also what's the collective organizations that can be put up against an all-powerful powerful kind of actors within urban environments, where you have gentrification and so on, displacement of people through that and so on. So I think there's a challenge that what are these oppositional forces? What are the collective forces that we think might emerge? I mean, at the moment, we're hearing about populism. We're hearing about, forces on the right in terms of the responses. But, are there other oppositional things that we can think of from our work that's flowing from the analysis that we have? Because if it isn't coming from our analysis, then we have to work harder, don't we, to dig that out, to show the possibilities, the potentials that we can point to.
Maybe that's the question for us all to end on. Maybe we're not going to get much further today. I know in the US, land back movements are a really important part of that. But yeah, maybe that's a question.
I would just add one thing that has been very much underplayed in this deep discussion is women's rights over their body. And this whole area of controlling by gender and by body is something that the series is interested in, and we must be interested in bringing out in these discussions, because every single one of them is very much relevant vis-a-vis control of individual bodies and groups of bodies.
Right. So land back movements and reproductive rights for everybody. Those are two things we can end with. Land back to Indigenous populations everywhere, and also to the public in the UK, as they've been dispossessed by these private enterprises. All right, anything else you'd like to conclude with, panelists? We're a couple minutes over time. All right, I guess I'm just going to thank everyone for attending today. And please send us any questions. We hope that you can come to our next event. Those of you in the SF Bay Area, we're having an in-person Zoom symposium, or I think there's a Zoom component too, a symposium on April 22nd. And you can find that info in the chat. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you all.